Now we are continuing down the pathway to the place of Jehovah Jireh. And in our study, we've come to the 18th chapter of Genesis. And it says here that the Lord appeared to him, Abraham, by the terebinth trees of Mamre, as he was sitting in the tent door in the heat of the day. Now, what I want to focus upon here is terebinth trees of Mamre is a place that we have read about along this pathway. Now let's go back to chapter 13, where we first saw the terebinth trees in the verse 18, when Abram moved his tent and went and dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre, and which are in Hebron, and built an altar there to the Lord. Now what has transpired here in chapter 13 this is the first place in the new promised land that God appeared to Abram. Okay, now that's important. This is the first place in the new promised land that God appeared to Abram, and what we see going on here is that Abram is a man that when he had an encounter with God, sought to place his tent there and dwell there. He sought to go back to that place, back to a place where he had communed with God, where he had experienced the presence of God, where God had spoken to him. What is this place? It's the terebinth trees of Mamre. The terebinth trees are a type of oak tree. Now, you've heard the expression, strong as an oak. Now, that's important also. This is a place where strong oak trees grew. Now, isn't that interesting? In the presence of God, these strong oak trees grew. Now, not just any oak trees, you understand, but this was an arid climate, a climate that was sparse of water. These terebinth or oak trees were the type of oak trees that had roots that went way down where the water was. Okay? They were deep-rooted trees that were not going to be easily uprooted, and they sought the water, which is a type of the Holy Spirit. They sought the presence of God. We see a connection here, but being strong and tall and seeking the presence of God, don't we? Here we are in the place where the terebinth trees are, and that place is called Mamre. Interestingly enough, Mamre means manliness. What we know is that manliness here, it does not just apply to a macho men kind of thing, but it is a reference to humanity, the way God created mankind or humanity to be. And so to understand that, we have to look at Adam. When Adam was created, he was created to have dominion over all that was. Now Eve, when she was brought out of his side, she also had dominion with him, all right, as his helpmate. But what we have here is a situation where long since man gave up, Adam gave up his dominion by disobeying God. And we've been talking a lot about obedience, haven't we? But the dominion that God gave the first Adam, we see in the last part of the 14th chapter of Genesis, where Melchizedek calls Abram a possessor of heaven and earth. We see a type of the restoration of mankind to the Adamic created role of dominion. We see that in place once again. So his manliness had to do with what God created mankind to be. God created mankind to be possessors of heaven and earth, and that is what we're talking about here. So this is the first place in the promised land where Abram meets with God. What we see here is a pattern where Abram pitches his tent there and continues to dwell there in order to be in the place where he hears from God, because he understands the connection with his role as a Mamre, his manliness, with his being a possessor of heaven and earth, is all about hearing from God and doing what God said. So he needs to be in the presence of God. So in this 18th chapter, in verse 2, we see three men appearing to Abram. Now, what's interesting here is that he begins to have a conversation with the Lord. It says in verse 1 that the Lord appeared to him, and so he lifted his eyes and looked in verse 2 and saw three men standing by him, and when he saw them, he ran to his tent door to meet them. So he had a recognition. The presence of the Lord was familiar to him. He had a recognition of the presence of the Lord. He wasn't fearful and ran away. He was excited and ran too. Now what's interesting here is that in the 33rd verse, the Lord leaves his presence, and in chapter 19, we see now, verse 1, now the two angels come to Sodom in the evening. Now, wait a minute. I thought that there were three men in the presence of Abram. Well, what happened to that third one? Well, the third one was the presence of the Lord. You see, presence of the Lord was in Sodom. God is omnipresent. He's everywhere. There's never a place where God isn't. Now, those angels aren't everywhere because they are not divine. They are not God. They went and they were there. Was God there also? Yes. But Lot and the people of Sodom did not see him. That's the point. So it's people that seek the presence of God, that recognize his presence, that are familiar with his presence, that run to his presence, that look forward to his presence. It is those people you see that can hear the voice of God. And that voice of God will make you, if you're obedient to it, will make you a possessor of heaven and earth, as Adam was intended to be. So tonight, as you're preparing your tithes and offering, what I want you to do is seek the presence of God. Many of you have already heard his voice at times in the past. You can hear his voice tonight because I assure you, God is here. The Holy Spirit is here. He is present, and he wants to speak to you. And if you hear his voice and you obey what he tells you to do, you will enter into that role that you were created to be, a possessor of heaven and earth.